AAPI Rising in the South series. Today, I am excited to introduce, first let me introduce myself. My name is Malcolm Phillips. I am the Civic Engagement Coordinator at Vayla, New Orleans. Today, I'm excited to have with us Victoria Huynh and Jacqueline, our very own Executive Director. Just for anybody who's just curious, today, this is just a series that we're starting where we're gonna get different AAPI leaders to just like have conversations about different civic engagement topics. Like today, mostly we're gonna be talking about Census, because that's like the main campaign we're overseeing right now, as well as everything about COVID-19. I mean, we're having this Zoom conversation right now, so I think that's a relevant thing to discuss, as well as how the census can play its role in the whole COVID-19 outbreak. So first thing I want to do is give Victoria and Jackie a chance to introduce themselves. Victoria, if you would like to go first.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Malcolm. And Jackie with Vayla. I'm so excited to be on this Zoom and this Facebook Live to be part of this first part of the series. I'm Victoria Huynh. I'm with the Center for Pan-Asian Community Services. I'm actually calling from our center here in Atlanta, Georgia right now. We have been around for about 40 years now, and our work has been serving and supporting immigrants and refugees within the state of Georgia and in the South. And we do that through three things: direct service. So a lot of the services are around social services, transportation. We are the only transit service provider nonprofit that sits with the likes of the mainstream MARTAs, Gwinnett County Transits. We're very proud of that. We also have a federally qualified health center, the first one in the state that serves immigrants and refugees. We serve youth, seniors, senior wellness programs. And we also do a lot of capacity building work, supporting our local partners, ethnic media groups. And we do that through funding and support, technical assistance, and partnership. And the third is the advocacy part. That is, one of my favorite things to do here at CPACS is that we, advocate for policy changes, legislation, and also do voter engagement and census. And so our team has been hard at work, 260 of us strong here. We serve about 70,000 people with 17 different languages.
Nice, that's really cool. Jackie, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'm just so thankful. And every time I hear Victoria talk, I get really excited because I feel like CPACS and her role there is just demonstrative of how much is possible when you work across cultural and ethnic lines. And I feel like that's something that we really need in the South, and in particular something in New Orleans. And we were just talking before we kind of open the call up. It's so important, I think, during these times to have conversations like this and really learn to build from each other and see how we can form stronger coalitions that nurture each other even when we're not in crisis. So Vayla, I think, as many of you know, emerged after the post-Katrina, during the post-Katrina reconstruction period. And it went from a community center that fought a really big fight and won against environmental racism by working across generational and cultural lines to an organization now that really is focused on how do we build intersectionality as Asian Americans, and how do we provide advocacy and leadership incubation for all the things that are to come in New Orleans and Louisiana, right? Are we providing leadership and advocacy efforts in all of the campaigns and all of the ways in which Asian Americans, and particularly in New Orleans, how we're affected by climate change, reproductive justice, and community organizing when we just don't have the same kind of digital infrastructure as our sisters and brothers on the coast? So those conversations are things that I think we're going to continue to have. We're really excited to engage in census and storytelling as a leadership model in the coming seasons. And I'm just really excited to have Victoria here and have this conversation today.
Great, thank you very much, Jackie. Just shout out to all of our viewers. If at any point you have a question, or maybe you hear something super interesting and you're like, oh, I would like to make a comment on that. We do have the chat open for everybody who's participating in the Zoom call, so feel free to drop a line. We have Anthony, our deputy director, moderating the chat right now, so just drop a line. I am also kind of like low-key checking the chat, so just drop it, and at some point I'll try and plug it in. We are also on Facebook Live right now, so anyone watching on that, you can also drop a line there. So cool. So the format of this discussion, thank you very much, Victoria and Jackie, for introducing yourselves. I basically have drafted a series of questions relating to both mainly census, but also COVID-19. But before we get into the main like meat of the questions, I wanted to ask some icebreaker questions just to get us into the flow of conversation and like really like set the tone of the conversation, if you guys don't mind. So first icebreaker question, what does it mean to be Asian American to you? And we could do this just like whoever wants to answer first.
All right.
There we go.
So, I had a chance to kind of bounce this question with our team too. And, the first thing I think of is Sandra Oh's shirt, that says, what an honor it is to be Asian American. I feel it, right? That was just when I saw that, I was like, how do I, that sums up everything that I'm feeling, especially, being May Asian Heritage Month, that honor. And then also just thinking about the resiliency within our communities, being a child of refugee parents and seeing my parents, move to this country and to build something great for us, their children, and to look forward and to, rock it out as, this, proud Asian American here in the United States. I mean, that's what I feel. And, that's definitely something I live by. And there was something that a team member reminded me of a saying, I am my ancestors' wildest dream. And I can't, that I want that to be plastered all over my office just to remind me of how incredible it is to be an Asian American, in this time doing this work.
I actually had a sticker of that quote on my first water bottle, and I love it. It's kind of like faded away now. I got to go get another one. I love that quote though. Thank you very much, Victoria. Jackie?
From a New Orleans native, Brandon B. Mike. So that's
Okay, yeah. That's where I got it from.
No, every time this question gets asked, I feel like, it depends on the audience, how you kind of respond and react to it. And I feel like being in this company feels like such a safe space, but in any space, we should feel like it's an honor to be an Asian American. But there's this beauty and pain and duality of, how we're often tokenized and used as a model minority in so many different situations. And our identity has become this source of weakness. And I think it's really time to flip that narrative and make it an asset in our life. And I think of, Dr. Hanani K. Trask, the Native Hawaiian woman who talks so often about using our identity as a source of power. And I think just as Asian Americans, we constantly reconcile our language, cultures, and kind of generational traumas. Our superpower really is this emotional agility and holding the frame so we survive. And I'm also a child of refugees, right? But my parents were both Chinese and Vietnamese. So growing up, there was this constant reconciliation of, what power looks like even in a household, like what language gets spoken, what are we eating tonight? And I think that fusion is both painful and what's so beautiful about being a child of the diaspora. It's this constant evolution and growing and understanding that we're stronger when we can understand that you can be different, you can have different pieces of you all be a part of the same whole self. And I think when we limit ourselves, we really make no room for failure or exploration. And I think it's really essential to show up as our whole selves, to lead our communities with our heart. So that's how we decolonize leadership, and that's how we decolonize the truth of being Asian American. And that's why I love Vayla.
Nice, nice. Thank you very much, Jackie. So this next question has a lot to do with like Asian American culture, right? So as Asian Americans, and like being that like model, like being stigmatized as that like model minority, right? I feel like there's a lot of pressure to like perform maybe that might be there. And so y'all are both leaders at your organizations. And so I'm interested in how your, like, how does being Asian American affect your leadership? Does it influence your leadership style differently, do you think? Or what do you think? Victoria, if you would like to answer this one first.
Yeah.
Just go back and forth.
You know, like at first glance, I was like, this is kind of a, you know, is it a simple question to ask? Is it a, you know, a difficult question for me to answer, right? And I think back at like just my journey in leadership as an Asian American woman, being a young Asian American woman coming into this space and being very fortunate enough to work at CPACS, an agency that's championed this area within the Asian American community. And then what does it look like when I have to, you know, go out of this Asian American space and advocate and work with our communities or work with other communities, you know, in places like governments, you know, at roundtables where folks don't look like me, don't understand my experience. And what I realized is, you know, I definitely had to step that up, right? It's just being, you know, raised a certain way of just putting my head down, being, you know, doing the best you can, working hard. And then really having to break out of that you know, that culture that I was raised in, and having to really, you know, work on that, right? And step out of that for my community, for the work that we're doing within the space. That comes with a lot of like, you know, questions of am I doing the right thing, or am I being authentic, right? Is this who I am? And I'm, you know, honestly, that journey is still happening for me. And, you know, when I'm in places where I'm the only person of color there, and already being recognized as an Asian American woman, representing the Asian American community at whole at these roundtables, there's definitely a lot of, you know, thoughts that come through my mind of how am I coming off, right? Am I doing my community justice by how I'm presenting myself? And, you know, that's not always something that you should expect of, you know, a person coming, but that's the reality, right? When someone sees you as the only person of color there, or as a representative of that agency. So that journey is still happening for me, of trying to be that authentic leader, right? With, you know, I know who I am, but how do I bring that forward when I'm advocating in this space?
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said, Victoria. I just like, that was so moving for me when you talked about authentic leadership. And I just think like, when I've seen you in kind of like spaces, it's always been in Asian American spaces. And it's like, even within the Asian American community, we are all so different, right? Like the way socioeconomic backgrounds, and I think first generation, second generation, third generation, all of which the ways in which we relate to each other are so different. And I think constantly about what leadership looks like in New Orleans and what leadership looks like in Atlanta. It's so different, but it's still the South. It's still a very black and white South. So.
Sweet, thank y'all very much. Yeah, I'm also, I think to like piggyback on what you said, Victoria, I think that's an issue where like constantly comparing yourself or constantly questioning yourself, like, am I doing this right? Am I being a good representation of my culture? You know, I think that's just something that you say that it's a journey that you're still on. I think it's a journey that POC are just inherently on, you know, in America. But I definitely need to get some pointers from you on how to like better navigate that, because y'all seem to be doing a bang up job. Okay, so next.
Before we
Oh, yes.
I just add, I'm sorry to send you a message, but I think it's just really profoundly important when we're Asian American leaders to also mention we're Asian American leaders as well. The way in which we have to interact with the world, and when we show up in a room and we're not just the only, Asian person there, we're the only Asian woman there. I think it speaks, there's so many implicit biases that we sift through and power dynamics that we sift through, but it's so important to be just vulnerable and be able to have these spaces where we talk about our leadership journey and how real, not just the model minority myth is, but how we navigate the bamboo ceiling, right? We constantly talk about women leadership in leaning in and breaking glass ceilings, but we can't break glass ceilings and not expect that there's glass at the bottom and that there are women that look like us that pick up the glass pieces with our bare hands and end up in middle management or end up in places where we feel very insecure about our ambition. And I don't think that's something we have to apologize for. And I think that ambition has always been sourced at a place of how do we fortify our communities, at least in how I see leadership in nonprofits and in community work. I think Asian American women have to rise up and do rise up to the occasion of protecting our communities when they need it most. And that's just really important. I think that distinction between being an Asian American leader and an Asian American woman leader, because the expectations are exponentially different.
Yeah, that's right. I'm gonna move into our last icebreaker question, just so we can get into the main questions here. And it's kind of a little bit of a segue. I'm gonna move a little bit away from Asian American culture and a little bit more on census now. So this icebreaker question is just, why is the census important to our communities, or specifically AAPI communities? Jackie, did you want to answer this one first, or?
Yeah, I definitely can. And I feel like, Victoria, like you did the 2010 one as well. And I always admire her speeches about census. But I think now more than ever during COVID-19, when we see a rise of anti-Asian sentiment, I always tell folks we're one cough away from yellow peril and we're here. I think it's just a vicious time. But I think we constantly ask for representation in Asian America, and we talk about like being in the media and being seen, and to be seen means to be accountable and, stand up when other folks are also hurting. And to be counted is it's not just the infrastructure resources, right? It's to be like, I'm here. You can't erase me. And I think there's something very profound about that statement beyond just the dollars. The dollars matter, and I think it's what holds a lot of politicians that are willing to talk to us accountable. But I think for the healing and restorative piece to it for our community, if we are able as community leaders to bridge that gap, for them to know that they matter, I think that's a profoundly healing tool that, traditionally has been weaponized against us when they're saying we're going to use a citizenship question, like you only count if there's this and that. And it's a way to really restore justice in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, it's about the history. I mean, it's API Heritage Month, and Asian Americans documentary on it's coming out on May 11th, and just to see the premiere of that and thinking of how our communities have been, the history of our communities have been captured, right? And just watching those clips now and feeling all of the pain, and then being proud of how we kind of moved along this history line, right, of where we are today. Of course, there's a lot of things that we're working on to make sure that our communities are strong and can thrive. But I think about how census could help us, help our future generations look back and see where we are in this point of time. And I know that with census, it's like that 72-year gap, right, where they release the data, and your children and your children's children can go back and find this community and where we are, that snapshot. And that's really important for me. You know, as my family, you know, and other people are trying to figure out, our Asian American community is trying to figure out, where do we stand in this history of America, right? Where do we plug into all of that? And I think Census is a vehicle for that, as a way for us to show up 72 years from now when that data is released, and you can go back and search for our community's names and how many of us, where were we, and then the growth, right, from 2020 into 2030, the next census. And you know, everything that you know, Jackie had mentioned, it's just it's this incredible tool, but you know, Jackie's right, there's just a lot of things that are stacked up against how our communities can participate. And I think there's also some fear of what it would really look like if there's an accurate count for our communities. And so I think just kind of looking at it and kind of both sides.
Yeah, so the 2010 census saw a rise in Asian Americans, or AAPIs in general, by like 55%, and that's still with AAPI people being considered hard to count, right? I think that it's like, it could be very empowering if we got more people more familiar with the census and could actually like interpret that, like how would they interpret that data about like their own identities, you know, to see that rise and growth, like, oh, we are one of the fastest growing communities in the country. Like that there is just like baseline representation, talk about like power building and all that. So yeah, I think that's very important. Great comments, y'all. Thank you very much. I think we're having a cool conversation here. So this next question, I'm gonna move into like our main topic questions here. And this next question is kind of similar to the one I just asked, but it's more in relation to like with the COVID-19 outbreak in mind, right? It's kind of crazy coincidence that like the year census is being conducted, we have some crazy pandemic going on. That's like, oh, this is kind of what, like, you know, healthcare funding is for things like this, you know. So this question is basically, with the effects of COVID-19 outbreak sure to linger for some time, why is it especially important for AAPI to get the most accurate count in the 2020 census? Victoria, if you wanted to lead on this one.
Yeah. I mean, 2020 is a rough year, I'm gonna be honest, right? And you know, with COVID and experiencing, you know, I was in Asia just, you know, earlier this year, and you know, coming back to the States, and you know, coming back into the reality of what it's gonna look like, you know, in the state of Georgia here, and seeing where it is right now. You know, a lot of people have been impacted and affected, and you know, I have friends and family who are, you know, dealing with COVID right now, and you know, I have them in my thoughts, and you know, I really pray that we're able to work together to find a solution and help our communities get through this. You know, whether it's, you know, families that are impacted, you know, small businesses, you know, youth that are going through a lot right now, being out of school, and you know, families who are just trying to figure out what life is, you know, being unemployed, or you know, not being able to do what they need to do with all the closures, and our seniors who are staying further isolated, you know, in this space. And you know, with census, that is the challenge right now, right? With the timeline being extended over to October, and moving a lot of our work that we were supposed to do in person, right? We wanted to do in person at these festivals and outreach, and to see our communities face to face, and now having to move everything digitally when we already know there's this digital divide in the South and, you know, a lot of the areas. I mean, those realities are there. And then we have things like public charge and you know, anti-immigrant sentiments that are going to prevent us from, you know, doing what we were planning to do for census. But we do know that with inaccurate counts, right, more resources are going to be available for our communities. That's just the reality of it. And as we're advocating for more business support, you know, with the counties and state, people are asking me, show me the data, right? Where are these small businesses? And that data can come from census, will come from census, will continue to come from census and other data resources. That was exactly what we did yesterday, and folks were asking us, well, what are the language needs? And we hosted the very first small business webinar where there were multiple languages translations happening. And we continue to advocate, but we also need to do that with census data. That's what all of the providers are requesting now, right? And healthcare and services. I mean, a lot of the funding for these services to our communities come from census data. And so the conversation with our community is not changing, but we've definitely see a lot of motivation and encouragement from our communities because they know they're seeing the linkage right between census and what it means for how to address some of these gaps and shortages they see now through the time of COVID.
Nice, thank you, Victoria. I think we are having a little bit of a connection issue. On your side, some of the things you're saying were a little broken up there. Jackie, could you hear her clearly? I think some people in the chat.
I got most of it.
Okay.
I can hear you perfect though.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to go ahead, Jackie?
I do agree with Victoria. I think census is where we get our data. It's where we get our infrastructure. It's our resources. And I think that's just going to, that's the way this country works. And I think, as just a recovering social worker, as I like to say, America is also just a huge, I think, montage and story of belonging and unbelonging. And I feel like every 10 years with the census, even though it's just this tiny piece of mail, there's this kind of quiet subconscious reckoning when it appears at my aunt's house or my mom's house, and they open it and it's okay, this is a government mandated piece of mail that they have to fill out, and they're asking all of these questions and they're like, well, why? And we have to remember that we come from places that have traditionally counted folks for kind of malicious and dark reasons sometimes in the Asian diaspora, right? The question of safety comes into mind, the question of security comes into mind, and I think that's the huge stigma around it. And you can't moneyball your way through the community with these issues. And with COVID happening and the effects of that is that you miss Songkran, you miss all of these different tech festivals and these things that would have happened and kind of been places to fortify relationships and have those one-on-ones and face-to-face to kind of bridge the disconnect from the government and the community. But now I think as community leaders, we need to have these conversations amongst ourselves and how we build that. And it's being there for folks during this pandemic. It's making sure that they eat. It's making sure that they have access to apply to unemployment. It's making sure that we're filling in gaps and holding government leaders accountable for the promises that they've made, and making sure that, the fastest growing group of AAPIs, though we are all AAPIs, that when it comes to even COVID, we need disaggregated data. We need disaggregated data for health and race purposes, and we have to see that census in many ways is also a social determinant of health for our communities to come. It's how we protect our communities, and it's how we make sure that in the next 10 years, the power imbalance doesn't continue to disenfranchise folks that don't have the same level of access that we do.
Yeah, I like, I find it interesting how you mentioned the history of counting people has been used maliciously a lot. And that reminded me of some data I found when I was doing research for this event. That's basically it's a speculation as to why, I'm sure it's very circumstantial, but as to why AAPI are considered hard to count, right? And it kind of leads me into my next question. This one is kind of long, so just bear with me. So the Census Bureau conducted a study between February and April 2018 and released a report in early 2019 stating that Asian Americans were the least likely to respond to the 2020 census. It's speculated that the cause is rooted in fears around immigration and providing personal information about themselves. Only 55% said they were likely to fill out the 2020 census. 38% said they were not familiar with the census. 41% said they were concerned that the answers provided would be used against them. So this next question is kind of like the hardest question for me to contemplate. It's like, how do you overcome that, like that stigma when it's rooted in something so like sensitive, you know? Like, how do you overcome this stigma of like not so much distrust in the government? Like, I don't want to make this like a conspiracy theory kind of thing, but just more like us, like concern for like yourself and your family in a country that, like, you know, puts us second, you know? So how should AAPIs and allies alike go about breaking the stigma around being counted in the census and encourage their communities to engage in the count?
I think I can kind of speak to that. I think the census is a challenge, you know, with all the reasons that you've just mentioned. But I think in every challenge, there's this just immense opportunity to rise to the occasion and kind of face head on how we can heal as a community, because healing only happens in community. So I think it can be something really restorative. Like, we can't forget the fact that census data was used to intern Japanese Americans. You know, we can't forget that. But I think like showing up in numbers and doing that and ensuring that there are enough of us doing it to make sure that never happens again, I think that's restorative. I think there's ways in which we can reframe how much of an asset we are in this country and how we've been contributing as AAPI folks, not just in the coast, but in the South. I think a lot of people don't know that there were Chinese in the Mississippi Delta, that, you know, the first Filipino settlers to come to New Orleans, you know, it did all of these amazing things. And those stories won't be told by anybody else except for us. And it requires being brave enough as we ask for representation in the media, and not just the arts, but as we ask for representation in places of power, that those stories are not just told by people who look like us, but people who understand that it has to go beyond looking the way you do, but really understanding the sacrifices of your ancestors so that you are where you are and you can kind of pay it forward. I think the Asian American Pacific Health Forum does a wonderful job of creating a very generalized community healthcare package, but it speaks very directly to individuals, I think, in the grieving process. And I think that's what, it goes back to the first question about being Asian American. I think being Asian American, like a lot of BIPOC, Black and Indigenous and people of color, you know, it's about being a hyphenated American and grieving, right? And I see the census, like Victoria says, as a vessel and a catalyst for so many things, but it's also an opportunity for us to really empower ourselves and say, hey, we're here and you can't scare us away, right?
Yeah. And yeah, and sorry about the internet issues. We're just having some bad weather, so hopefully it should be okay now. I switched over. But you know, when we're talking about the stigma of filling out census, I think, you know, when you talk about Asian Americans, we're so diverse. I mean, look at all the ethnicities that, you know, fall under this umbrella of Asian American, and then the languages, right? And the cultural pieces, geographies, like where we are, and, you know, rural, urban, and, you know, different areas and different counties. And so what we learned, you know, when we started this journey with 2020 census in 2018 and started talking to our community leaders, I think that's where we have to go. We have to go to the roots, right? And kind of understand what all of our communities are thinking when we say census. What does it translate into? How do they describe it, right? And we learned so much when we started doing these kind of breaking bread with our different community leaders and going out and talking to folks. You know, we learned from the Bhutanese community, right? The last time they did census in their home country, they were being literally forcibly kicked out of their country. And so when you hear census, you know, like nobody wants that, right? Because that's something that they've experienced. And having that heart-to-heart conversation and letting, you know, and talking about what census means in the United States, and, you know, also acknowledging, you know, the fears around census, that, you know, that was their community's reality. And then, when we're talking about other communities who've been here, experience, many generations of census, and, hearing that, when they completed census, they didn't see the resources come to them, right? And that's what people see now. And I think we just have to have that heart-to-heart conversation and really break down what census impacts or influences in our communities, and talk about the schools and roads and potholes and hospitals, in addition to talking about the history of our communities. And there's just so many great narratives out there around census, and they're all true. A lot of these things, what census, how census is important, what census is important, what ways census is important to us. It's going to hit everyone differently. And so just making sure that we, speak to the community, right? They know what's best in their communities. We don't claim to be technically experts in census, but we know that when the community has more information about census, they want the best for their community. And so all the conversations that we have with our communities, they know that census is something that will really help move their communities forward, with resources and services.
Yeah, I like the what you said, how basically it starts with a conversation, right? And so that sparks a question in me, and it's more of like a personal question, like more focused on like the AAPIs and allies alike part, like so like this whole moderation is coming from my perspective, is coming from a Black perspective. And so sometimes I'm not sure how like to engage in that conversation with an Asian American person without like stepping on some toes or stepping over my boundaries. How do you think like allies should go about, or is it even a non-Asian American person's place to have that conversation? Is it something that should be like held within the community? Or how do you think the ally role plays in that, in breaking the stigma around census? Jackie or Victoria?
Yeah, I think it's really important to show up for each other. I mean, that's like the basic way of talking about allyship. But I think it has to be this mutuality in understanding that, like, we don't know what we don't know until we ask and have these conversations. And I think the AAPI community in it of itself has grown so much during this pandemic, right? I think we see a lot of first-time activists and folks that are standing up and, in situations where things like this have been happening to Black and brown folks for the existence of American society and American life, right? And I think when it comes to something like census in particular, when you're in an organizational or activist space, I think it's having that bravery and courage. I keep going back to that, to lead with your heart and really connect with folks in a way where it's genuine and authentic. Mm-hmm. And, in a world where call out culture is just rampant, we have to make provisions, I think, within the BIPOC community to take care and nurture each other. Because it's not, you cannot expect the master's tool, as Audre Lorde says, to dismantle the master's house, right? But I think we can allow for innovation and strategic happenings to occur between folks of color and Black people. And I think that, like, conversations like this and the intention of creating leadership, even in Vayla, is that we create an AAPI lens, but also, while incubating leaders, have them have the intersectional lens and wherewithal to build solidarity amongst leadership, amongst like folks all across the community to work interethnically and interculturally. I think it takes time. And like I like to say all the time, you just can't moneyball your way through these issues. It's not just program funding. It's not just census funding. It's how do we have, like, the process matters so much. And I think that's what census is teaching us, that the process of connecting to folks matters as much as them just submitting something. Because it's also an opportunity for the Census Bureau to, really show how they're responding to our communities, how much they really say they care and need these numbers for the right reasons. They're doing it the right way. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you basically just answered my last question. I was attempting to segue into it, but then you just like nosedive. Um, but yeah, I think everything you said is very important. Victoria, I just wanted to go ahead and ask you the actual official question and get your comments. It's basically oftentimes crises present a unique opportunity for unity in a disorder. With societal issues like COVID-19 affecting Black communities disproportionately and the spike in discrimination towards Asian Americans amid the pandemic, how can organizations utilize the crisis to create intentional, lasting solidarity among POC communities? And how can we do that without undermining the work that's already being done in those communities?
Yeah. I think we definitely have to start by acknowledging, all the work that's came before us, right? Of, bringing us to this point of civil rights movement, a lot of the work that's happening within the South of creating better narratives for communities of color. And those narratives are coming from us and not by folks that are kind of observing and thinking that they know what's going on here in the South and what's happening in our own respective states. As I think about this, it's a work in progress, and we definitely need to do better, especially during this time of COVID. I think of what would be the ideal situation, right? And I think of our communities, wishing that our communities had the infrastructure built already of working together. But I know that there are many incredible partners like Asian American Advancing Justice Atlanta, and a lot of our groups here in the state of Georgia that have, been doing this work, have been, successful, have been, really building the train tracks so that we can have these conversations together. And that when we're out there advocating for what is right for our communities, justice for our communities, that we're creating the space for all of our communities to do that together. And as an agency, we reflect on, how can we do better at doing that? And, and that's what our team's having a conversation now, as we're working through all the direct service needs. How can we be better at expanding our work and connecting with those who, from other communities who are doing the same thing? But how do we further that work, right? How do we um, strategically come together to connect and to bring more resources to our communities? We're all, suffering together in a lot of these pieces around things that are happening to our communities, lack of resources, the hate, the violence that's happening to our communities. So I think that's something that we are yet to see the full potential of what that is here in the state of Georgia. But there's so many incredible things that are happening, and we'll continue to work on that in the state of Georgia.
Cool. Thank you very much, Victoria. We are getting close to time. So before we move into our closing questions, I just wanted to open up the floor for anybody who is still with us in the Zoom meeting or anybody who's in the Facebook. I actually can't seem to pull up the actual Facebook live feed here. So I am relying on either Anthony or Ellen, who might be watching it, to send me a message if somebody sends a question in that. But I just want to, okay, cool. Thank you, Anthony. I just want to open the floor to anybody. Feel free to turn your mics on or drop a question in the chat, just to have open Q&A for just a few minutes. Anybody feel free. No questions? Well, cool. You guys must be giving really, really elaborate answers to questions. Lauren says not a question, but you all are amazing. Thank you very much. Sweet. Well, then I guess we can go ahead and move into our closing questions here. So we kind of answered this one already, and Victoria, I think your answer was basically that it's a work in progress. The question is, what does intersectional organizing look like right now? And I think I agree with you that it's a like it's a hard thing, it's a touchy thing, you know, because just coming from my perspective, like, so I don't have like too much experience, obviously nowhere near as much as you both do, with this kind of like organizational work. Um, but just speaking from a personal vantage point, I'm always like cautious trying to like enter into someone else's uh, world, because like I'm never aware of uh, like the thing about ignorance is that you don't know that you're ignorant until you know somebody tells you, which is like what Jackie said is part of the important important part of just like starting the conversation. um and so I think it's the kind of thing that we do have to like, it's going to be a bit of trial and error, right? But like I definitely don't want to be the reason that something like doesn't work. And so I'm interested in like what, if we can't say, if we can't say exactly what it does look like, could we at least say what it doesn't look like, right? What would your thoughts on that be,
I think
Jackie? Or
way of framing the question, like what intersectional organizing doesn't look like. I think that's going to require a bit more thought. But in general, I think like knowing yourself well enough, and this knowing yourself well enough to develop humility in leadership. And I don't mean leadership like you don't have to be an executive director or a vice president of an organization leader. I think I see like the older lady down the street collecting the cans, and she's a leader in her community because she's creating significant change in the choices that she's making every day. And I think that's what it means to be a leader, you know? But in terms of intersectional organizing, I think it's the capacity to know that you can always do better. You know, we work around a lot of zealots and a lot of folks who feel like this is the right way, this is the right way. And I think true courage and true bravery in leading with your heart is getting up every day and developing and practicing your critical thinking and think about, in this moment, do I stand up or do I stand down? You know, and as a person of color who, you know, we all are oppressed, but our oppression manifests itself in very different ways, right? So are we passing the mic, and are we uplifting the voices of folks who haven't traditionally had a chance to speak? You know, we've learned during COVID-19 that there's a very strong Vietnamese American presence. It's how Vayla has come about. It's our origin story. But we also have Filipino brothers and sisters here, you know, in the city. We have an Indonesian community. We have a Thai community. And we have folks that have kind of worked in silos and kind of alone. How do we create a sacred space where we feel safe amongst each other, and we're able to share our stories and also nurture each other's cultures and uplift each other with the power that we do have? I think that's intersectional organizing. And even between the Latinx community and Black and Brown folks, I think that's the goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because we're more of a direct service agency, and as we, you know, looked at this question, trying to figure out, you know, of all the possibilities of how to answer this question, you know, we thought about, you know, civic engagement and, you know, voter engagement and census, and what does that mean for our communities as we're doing, you know, our work around transportation, as we're doing our work around, you know, food stamp SNAP, as we're doing our work around language access. And it's all, you know, it's all related, right? As we're talking about how our communities are looking at, you know, what power do we have? How are we building power in our communities? We have to look at all aspects, right? And, you know, have to work with our communities to better flesh out that narrative of, you know, what does it mean when we're advocating for more funding for a SNAP program, right? It's not necessarily yes, it's a hand up, but we're also thinking about the future of our communities. How do we move our communities, you know, through the socioeconomic, you know, range, right? And moving them forward, and also building power in our communities to move people out of poverty, And transportation, right? I mean, Atlanta doesn't have a regional transportation system. And as we're talking about how are people getting to and from voting poll locations, and we have to work all of that in, right? When we having a conversation with the community, we can't just talk about transportation and not talk about the policies and the people who are representing us. You know, do they represent us, right? And so that's something that I think our team has been just incredible at connecting those dots for our communities and not having these silo conversations. And so in Atlanta, I think it's very much needed to be more intentional about, you know, intersectional organizing.
Yeah, I think it's important to add with Victoria's point. It's not just working across racial and cultural lines, but working across disciplines. You know, like who's holding who accountable? Like, are we, you know, as a youth organization or a community organization, are we talking to folks who have done this work for decades in the South that represent AAPI communities? Are we talking to folks in housing in New Orleans? Are we talking to folks within our coalition and really fortifying, you know, all of the voter requirements that are currently changing right before us, right? So these are essential because aside from the lack of accessibility and surviving for a lot of our community members being hard to count, like a lot of times you see it, Malcolm, working at Vayla, like we fill in the gaps for translating. And that's an access issue, right? I mean, the government exists for the people. If the people don't have access, you know, we have to hold them accountable. So that's a part of intersectional organizing when we expand that definition as well. We have to know how to navigate and traverse these really different terrains that weren't meant to have our folks thrive.
Yeah, I think Jackie made a very important point where basically you're like, oh, are we passing the mic, right? And I think one of the hardest parts for me is like knowing when, and I think I've observed it. It's like the hardest part for everybody is knowing when to stand up and when to sit down, you know, because sometimes like leading the front means like taking a step back, you know? And I think that's very difficult to know when to do, especially when like you're in organizing, because like typically you're a passionate person, right? And you like want to fight for equity and justice, but like sometimes that fighting means letting someone else speak, you know? And so I think that's very important. We do seem to have received a question in our chat, so I'm going to take some time to read that real quick. This question comes from Shell. They say, you both shared great points on the importance of Census 2020. When encountering people that are averse to the census, any tips on how to convey their mind, like convey or change their mind?
So that's kind of and it really depends, right? And I think one thing is we have to acknowledge a lot of the fear that already exists. I mean, around when we're talking about possibly having the immigration question on census, or, you know, communities who are part of mixed status families, or, you know, families who have experienced a lot of trauma, right, with census in their own home countries. And that's where we have to acknowledge that that's not something that we could erase. But what we could do is, you know, continue to, you know, let our communities know the importance of what it will mean if there is an accurate count for census, what it means for our history, what it means for the resources, what it means to build power, so that, you know, we can address the gaps and injustice that our communities are experiencing day to day, you know, with our kids being in trailers, right? Because we did not accurately plan for space at schools for children to learn, you know, when we are sitting in hours of traffic, right? And maybe these roads are meant for, you know, roads where a lot of our, you know, various, you know, workers are utilizing, right? It's not a toll road, or maybe there is a toll road, and hospitals, right, where our health centers located, where our communities access preventative care. I think when we break it down and talk about these issues that prevent our community's like health, growth, our communities are very receptive to that. They're motivated to, but we also have to understand that there's going to be, a lot of these anti-immigrant, anti-sentiment, the political landscape that will prevent them, and we have to acknowledge that.
I agree. I think there's understandable resistance, and I'm kind of interpreting the question as like a very practical one. And I agree with Victoria entirely. I think as a previous canvasser, a constant advocate who, I think it's important to be at the front line and understand those narratives that people hold, and people tell themselves stories and kind of reinforce those stories daily to live, right? And to challenge that is to ask them to do something different, like Census. And the first step to doing any of that is to validate that their feelings are very real, that reality is very real, and this very foreign object and process like may or may not do something for them, but this is what it means. And I think it's learning to accept that, like, if somebody says no, it's okay, but it doesn't change how you should keep trying. And I think it really comes down to this use of self that I encourage for folks, especially AAPI leadership, and like for young folks kind of working their way to forge a path forward for themselves. It's this willingness to kind of fail. I think I mentioned this before. It's that AAPIs have this immense emotional agility, and like we are amazing at holding the frame to survive as people. And part of decolonizing ourselves and decolonizing leadership is that when you show up whole, you have to like expect to fail sometimes. You have to expect to grieve, and being brave enough to do that, and then see that sometimes you're just planting seeds and you don't see what grows is really important.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. You always have to like expect conflict, So we have a little bit of time. Great question, Shell, by the way. So I just want to take our last couple minutes to ask y'all our closing question here, which is just kind of like an open question, but basically just what inspires you to continue doing this work? Victoria, if you would graciously lead us out. Thank you.
Wow. So many things are just crossing my mind, but I know that just hearing my family story of their challenges and what they're going through, and even on my husband's family of language access, healthcare access, and seeing the hardships that my family's having to go through just because they are new to America, definitely inspires me to continue to do what I'm doing. The clients that come through here, we have community members that are just going through some hard times. They've experienced a lot of hardship, and yet our community members are still coming through and, making sure we eat, making sure we have, food and drinks while they're experiencing hardship themselves. Really shows me that our community is just so resilient, right? That it comes from a very amazing, and it kind of makes me emotional, right? And I think that's what inspires me to come to work, wake up, get angry at so many things that are happening in the state of Georgia and the South, right, in the nation. It makes me want to do more, right? Work those long hours and, make sure that things that were not, I guess, meant for us is that we, crash those parties and make sure that our communities get those resources and get those services and get that funding and that representation that we deserve. So it's about the people. I think these stories of our communities and our staff, our clients, my family's history is just, but all just, makes me want to do more.
Jackie?
It's so interesting because I think we constantly talk about, as Asian American leaders, being in the room and being the only one there. And what inspires me is not being a part of that space, but building our own. I think like for long enough, we've been, I feel like going through my own leadership journey and going through higher education and doing the nonprofit work I've done, It's always been about earning a seat at the table. And I have to remind myself, who built the table? Who built the house, right? So I think there's something sacred about not asking permission and showing up every day and being able to create opportunities for each other. Because I think we live in a world where we constantly talk about dismantling this, dismantling that. And I'm one person, and being in my 30s, I know that I can't dismantle colonialism, imperialism, and all of these things that happen. But what I deeply believe in is this capacity to create and forge pathways the way my ancestors have. And I think being able to, you know, see staff like you and also like Ellen and program coordinators and like different folks come through and really discover their purpose through their identity and through their passion for the community in redefining the community is what's so meaningful for me and inspires me to continue doing this work.
That's beautiful. I can tell you, both of y'all are an inspiration for me personally. Yeah, this is great. So that is all the time we have today. I want to thank Victoria and Jackie for this excellent conversation that we just had. This was our first installation. Super excited. Yeah. I do want to plug in. I want to thank everybody who's still with us watching either on Zoom or on Facebook. I do want to plug in a couple things before I let everybody go. I am running, or Vayla is running a Census rally raffle event, which is basically just meant to get the energy flowing about filling out the census, right? If you go to our Instagram, you will find instructions on how to enter the raffle. Just follow us, like, tag, have a chance to win a gift card from a local restaurant. So we can kill two birds with one stone, right? We can raise census awareness as well as support some local restaurants, which really need it in this time of isolation right now. So y'all head over to our Instagram, which is just at Vayla, spelled Vaylano. Check us out. Another thing I wanted to mention was I do a census walkthrough, a live event every other Wednesday. The next one will be on May 13th. There'll be a lot like this, only it'll just be me personally talking to you on a screen and just walking people through how to fill out the census online, which is the first time we can do this, right? Basically just showing just how easy it is to do. If you've watched it before, come hang out with me again. Bring some questions or maybe bring some friends, share it. Sweet. Once again, thank everybody for watching. Thank you, especially Victoria, for joining us today. Thank you, Anthony and Ellen, for, kind of moderating and monitoring everything for us. And yeah, hope to see y'all on the next installations. Y'all go follow us on social media so you get updates about future events like this.
Thank you so much, Vayla, for all that you're doing. We're such big fans of you guys here in Atlanta. And thanks, Jackie and Malcolm.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. Jackie, any closing words?
Yeah, no, I just really appreciate you, Malcolm, and we're really excited. Please check out all the amazing Census Live walkthroughs that Malcolm does. He's very thorough. And really, if you guys want to support any of the Vayla New Orleans initiatives, we're partnering with the Veggie Cooperative, and we're going to be bringing fresh produce to about 300 families in the coming weeks. So that's really exciting for us, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Nice. Sweet. Well, thank y'all very much. Y'all have a good one. Stay safe out there. Remember to wash your hands, please. Bye, y'all.